April 19th, 1943, there are only 3 Rabbanim still left in the Warsaw Ghetto. 3 Torah giants, 3 Go'enei Olam. Their names may not be familiar to many. Their names were Reb Shimshon Stockhammer, Reb Menachem Zemba, and Reb David Kahana Shapiro. These 3 Rabbanim convened in possibly one of the most frightening decisions in recent Jewish history. And they only had 60 minutes to make their decision. They were just given word by the Judenrat that the church, the Catholic Church of Warsaw, has granted permission that these 3 tzaddikim were allowed to leave the ghetto, and if they did, their lives would be spared. And they had 60 minutes to make this fateful decision. Just to give you a little example, what the conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto were at the time, no language has ever been created to describe the deplorable conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. So I read to you a first-hand account, an eyewitness account from my grandfather, may God watch over him, in an article that he wrote in a book called Theological and Halachic Reflections on the Holocaust. My grandfather writes, Ani hagever ra ani b'shevet avrasai. I am the man who has seen the affliction of my people. I am the victim, and I am the witness. I saw the Warsaw Ghetto littered with corpses, faces distorted, eyes bulging, eyes opened wide, skulls crushed, blood everywhere, the blood of our children, the blood of our brothers and sisters, the blood of our fathers and mothers. No imagination, no matter how daring, could possibly conceive of anything that we have seen. In 1942, my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, the last Rav of the city of Sakhachev, was taken to the Warsaw Ghetto with his children, my grandmother included, and they get to the Warsaw Ghetto and immediately the Gestapo knocks on the door. They grab away my grandmother's oldest brother, Shmuel Hersh. They never saw him again. This was the horror that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. At this point in time, there's very little that these 3 Rabbanim were able to contribute or add to their kehilos, to their brethren who were suffering in the Warsaw Ghetto. And to make matters worse, if that was even possible, the date was April 19th, 1943. However, if anybody knows their history, April 20th was the birthday of the Führer, was Hitler Yamach Shemoy's birthday. And Himmler decided that he was going to give Hitler a birthday present, and that is he was going to annihilate and completely obliterate the Warsaw Ghetto within 24 hours in honor of Hitler's birthday. People were streaming into Rav Menachem Zemba's home with problems pressing on their heart. Nobody should ever know of such problems. Let me give you a little picture of who Rav Menachem Zemba was. This great tzaddik, this great Gaon. Already in the 1930s, Rav Menachem Zemba was offered to be the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. Upon the untimely passing of Rav Meir Shapiro, they offered Rav Menachem Zemba to be the next Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin. Before Rav Menachem Zemba was 40 even, he was the honorary chairman of the Agudas Yisrael in Europe. Rav Menachem Zemba had written more than tens of thousands of Chidushei Torah, tens of thousands of halachos. My grandfather remembers that if you'd go into Rav Menachem Zemba's home and you look behind his chair, there was a big bookcase that stood behind his chair, not full of Sfarim, full of manuscripts of Chidushim that Rav Menachem Zemba wrote. He wrote thousands of pages of Chidushim on the Rambam, called Machazeh HaMelech. They were completely destroyed. Thousands of pages of Chidushim on the Yerushalmi, called Menachem Yushalayim, completely destroyed, and there were tragic scenes taking place in the home of Rav Menachem Zemba. Couples had come to him to get divorced. You see, what happened was, if somebody had the ability to escape the ghetto, but the wife didn't want to go along. She was afraid. She had a Jewish face. She was afraid she would be caught. Or if she had elderly parents behind, and the couple didn't know what to do, the husband was able to escape. The wife didn't want to hold him up, but how could she leave her parents? Or she was afraid she would get caught. And so they decided against their will that they're going to get divorced. And the couple comes in streaming tears. And Rabbi Menachem Zemba arranges a get for these couples, weeping along with them. Like the Gemara tells us, when a couple gets divorced, the Mizbeach itself weeps bitter tears. It was like the Mizbeach was weeping along with these couples. And these three Rabbanim had 60 minutes to decide whether they could save their own skin. But on the other hand, what would this do to the morale of their brethren who are still trapped in the Warsaw Ghetto? And what do? They convene a Bezdin. Now this is not a regular Jewish court case. This is a case that we call Dinei Nefashos. This was a capital case, and as such, in a capital case, the halacha is Poischin Bekatan. You start with the youngest member of the court. And the youngest member of this court was Reb David Kahana Shapiro. And they turned to him for his opinion on this very severe matter. And Reb David Kahana Shapiro declares from the depths of his soul, he says, I'm the youngest one here, and really, my words are not binding on any of you. We already know that there's nothing we could do to help our brethren in the camp here. Their fate has been sealed. But by staying with them and not abandoning them, we're encouraging them, we're strengthening them. This is the only thing we could do for them in the final hour. I simply do not have the strength to abandon our brothers in their time of need. Can we hide from the Almighty? The same God that is found in the ghetto here is outside the ghetto. How can we leave them at their time of need? And Rav Shimshon Stockhammer and Rav Menachem Zemba are looking at him, are looking at Rav David Kahana Shapiro, and they don't comment. There's nothing left to say. Rav Menachem Zemba gives the final decision. He says, case closed. There's nothing more to discuss. That's the halacha. We are going to stay here. Rav Menachem Zemba goes out to the Judenrat, and he tells them, if it is the will of the Almighty for us to die with the Jews of Warsaw, then that is what we're going to do. So I heard this story about a year ago from Rabbi Chanan Zon, the head of the Chevra Kadisha. And Rabbi Zon has a very strong family connection with Rav David Kahana Shapiro. And he mentioned to me what a difficult psak it is to understand how these Rabbanim decided to sort of risk their lives and give up their lives in order to stay with their brethren in the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, what could they possibly have done for their brethren in such a terrible situation? Their fate had been sealed. You know, immediately on April 20th, the Nazis came. They poured gasoline on every home in Warsaw. They set every home aflame. And as the homes were going up in flames, Jews were running out of the house, and they were shot dead on the spot. What possibly could these Rabbanim have accomplished, have contributed? What encouragement could they have given in this final hour? Is this really the halacha? Isn't the halacha v'chaya achicha imach chayecha koidem, which means that one's life takes precedence? Why did these chachamim have the need and feel that it was important for them to stay with their brethren in the Warsaw Ghetto? And it's a historic fact that many Admorim, many Rebbes, many Rosh Yeshiva who had the opportunity to save their own skin and save their lives, they took advantage of it, while thousands and thousands of their students and Hasidim burnt in the crematoria or were gassed to death. But these Gedolim who took the opportunity to leave, they were able to come to America, they were able to go to Eretz Yisrael, to rebuild their lives, rebuild their yeshivas, rebuild their chassidusim, and to a large degree, the rebuilding of the Jewish people today, and the flourishing and the continuity And the revival of Klal Yisrael today was because these Rosh Yeshiva and these Rebbes took advantage of the opportunity to save their own lives. If you look in the Sefer Zichron Shmuel are the Chidushim of Reb Shmuel Rozovsky, the Rosh Yeshiva of Panovich. He writes that in 1941 in Panovich, the Nazis came, they rounded up the entire city into the forest, and they murdered en masse the entire city. Does anybody know how many Lithuanian Rabbanim survived the Holocaust? None. 0. Actually, there's one exception. There's only one Rav from Lita who survived the Holocaust, and that's the Panovich Rav. You know how he survived the Holocaust? Because he wasn't there. The Panovich Rav was in Palestine at the time, en route to come to America to fundraise for his yeshiva. The Panovich Rav literally traveled the globe to be able to fundraise for the yeshiva. I was just in Cape Town in South Africa. So they said, no, the Panovich Rav was already here. You know, the joke goes, how do you know there's no life on Mars? Because if there was, the Panovich Rav would have fundraised over there already. And the Panovich Rav, luckily, was not there when the city of Panovich was rounded up. Writes the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Shmuel Rozovsky, that Rav Kahaneman spent the rest of his life tormented by the idea that he was able to save his own life while the rest of his family and the rest of the city perished and were murdered in the Holocaust. Rav Shmuel Rozovsky writes, Lo matza manoyach lenafsho, Rav Kahaneman had no respite. V'tadir hitzikoloi, he was constantly tormented and plagued. V'hidiras menuchasai hamachshava, that hitzalti es atzmi v'sfinasi lo hitzalti. He was constantly plagued by the thought that he was able to save his own skin and he didn't save the rest of the city. And all of his efforts and all of his undertakings on behalf of the Panovich Yeshiva was all so that he would not have to face that question of hitzalti es atzmi v'esfinasi lo hitzalti. The Radzina Rebbe, a scion of the Radzina dynasty, was offered safe passageway to escape. He was given safe passage to Warsaw, but he displayed extraordinary courage. He stayed behind to help his fellow Jews. When the Gestapo sees that the Rebbe is sort of encouraging the people, giving the people strength, the Gestapo demanded that either Rav Leiner, the Radzina Rebbe, hands himself over, or the entire city would be wiped out. Calmly, the Radzina Rebbe delivers himself, presents himself to the Gestapo, where he's brutally beaten. And in 1942 in Sobibor, the Radzina Rebbe was gassed to death. He could have saved himself. He chose not to. There was a Rav in Croatia, Rabbi Charles W. Steckel, the chief rabbi of Osijek, Slovenia. He gets a telegram. He gets a message from the former chief rabbi of Slovenia, somebody by the name of Rabbi Dr. Simon Unger. He gets a telegram. The telegram says, Berach lecha, get out of here. You stay here in Slovenia, you're a dead man. So that's what he did. He told the people, Berach lecha, get out of here. He told the people to run away. But he stayed with whoever remained. In December 1940, he was offered an escape route. He refused twice. And he was Moiser Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, and miraculously he actually survived the war. There was a rabbi in Italy, Rabbi Riccardo Pacifici. He was also given the opportunity to flee the city, and he was gassed to death in Auschwitz in 1943 in December. You should know that communities were not so kind to their rabbanim who forsook them at their time of tsar. I'm not going to mention the name, but in 1940, the chief rabbi of Rome, you could look it up, chief rabbi of Rome got word from the Catholic Church that he would be given safe haven by the church. He took advantage of it. The chief rabbi of Rome saved his life during the Holocaust, while much of the community was persecuted. 1945, the war is over. The rabbi wants his job back. He comes back to Rome. Hey, I'm the chief rabbi. They said, Rabbi, now you return to us. You forsook us in our time of need, and now you come back to us. They didn't accept him. He was rejected. And painfully, and this is a source of great anguish, the chief rabbi of Rome, a great Rav, after the Holocaust, converted to Catholicism. Why? Because he forsook his people in a time of need, and they didn't take him back in 1945. In a twist of history, the irony of history is that his granddaughter recently converted back to Judaism. A number of Gedolim exhibited extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary courage in returning to their Kehilas. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, Hashem Yimkoim Damai. Rabbi Chanan was in New York City at the time. Rabbi Chanan was in New York City. He was fundraising for Baranovich. The administration in Yeshiva Tarvadas says, you stay right here, Rabbi Chanan. You're going back to Europe. You stay right here. Rabbi Chanan says, what am I going to do here? Rosh Shlomo Hyman, Rosh Yeshiva of Tarvadas, said, I will step down. You will be the Rosh Yeshiva. What about my Talmidim in Baranovich? They said, don't worry, we'll get visas, we'll rescue your Talmidim. Rabbi Chanan said, no, cannot forsake my 400 children in the yeshiva. Rabbi Chanan went back to Baranovich. Rabbi Chanan was murdered in the war. And I'm very proud to say, and yet it's very painful, my great-grandfather, the last Rav of the city of Sachachav, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Volman, was offered by the Agudas Yisrael a very prestigious position in America. They offered him to be chief rabbi of America to save his life. He didn't accept it. He went down with the people of Sachachav, and he was Moiser Nefesh and killed Al Kiddush Hashem in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is the fateful decision that Rav Shimshon Stockhammer and Rav Menachem Zemba and Rav David Kahana Shapiro are faced with. What should the leader do at the time the community is B'tzar? Should they try to save their own life? Should they try to protect themselves? Or should they stay with the people? And you should know, whenever we have a halachic question, what do we do at a certain situation? We always have to look back at the precedent. What did the previous Gedolim do? And incredibly, if you look in the writings of the Chassam Sofer, the Chassam Sofer alludes to this in his Chidushim HaMesech Chulin. In the Drashas Chassam Sofer, the Chassam Sofer in 1809 writes that 60 years ago, when the city of Prague was in siege, in 1749, who was the Rav in Prague? None other than the Noid of Yehuda. The Noid of Yehuda decided he's going to leave the city. He's required to leave the city. He needs to save his own life. And the leaders of the city of Prague disagreed. They said, Rabbi, you're not going anywhere. You're sticking it out with us. Says the Chassam Sofer, we understand why the Noid of Yehuda wanted to leave. The halacha is, if a person's in danger, he needs to leave immediately. One is not allowed to stay b'makom sakana. If somebody stays in a dangerous situation, even if a miracle happens, all their mitzvahs will be taken away. But says the Chassam Sofer, the leaders of the city of Prague acted for themselves, almost selfishly. They demanded that the Noid Yehuda stay. Why? So that the Noid Yehuda should be a zechus and a protection for them. Says the Chassam Sofer, the city of Prague held that they had the right to hold on to the Noid Yehuda, and because the Gadol b'Yisrael is required to act with almost abandonment and protect the city at the expense of his own life. On the other hand, says Chassam Sofer, that there are many Jewish communities throughout history that disagreed with the practice of the city of Prague. Says in Noid Yehuda, I remember when the city of Mainz was in siege, and their Gadol was Reb Chaim Hersh. They sent Reb Chaim Hersh to Frankfurt. The community of Koblenz, their Gadol was Reb Ziskin Gundrish. They sent him out of the city. Says Chassam Sofer, my own Rebbe, the Hafla, when the city was in danger, escaped the city with the permission of the leaders of the city, because the city held that why should the Gadol suffer while we're suffering? Says Chassam Sofer, that makes more sense. Why should the city have to worry about the welfare of their rabbi while they're suffering? Says the Chassam Sofer, in his opinion, it's actually to the city's benefit to send the gadol out of the city. Why? So that he could pray for them in safety, so that he could protect them. More that the gadol could do for the people if he's out of the city than if he's with the people. And then, incredibly, the Chassam Sofer writes, it is actually a skula for the city to send the rabbi out, and that the rabbi should be in Golos as a protection for the city. Says Chassam Sofer, it's a pasuk in the Chumash. Vayihi ben Soya ha'arayin. Then when the Arayin is moved, who's the Arayin? The Talmud Chacham. When the Talmud Chacham goes into Golos, what does Ribbon Shalom say? Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu ayavecha. The Ribbon Shalom says, when the rabbi goes into Golos, then the enemy will be destroyed. Bottom line, says the Chassam Sofer, halacha l'maisa. What should the gadol do when the city is in siege, when the people's lives are on the line? Says the Chassam Sofer, ha'olam izeh ki yesh kan machloikes ben hanhagas manhigei Prague lahanhagas hakehilos Frankfurt. That it was an ancient machloikes, that the debate, that the dilemma that Rabbi Menachem Zemba and Rabbi Shimshon Stackhammer and Rabbi David Kahana Shapiro faced, that dilemma was an ancient dilemma going back to the communities of Prague and Frankfurt. By the way, Chazon Ish also survived the Holocaust by not being there. And later when Gedolim would ask the Chazon Ish, what should we do? Should we stay with our Kehilos or should we abandon them? The Chazon Ish said, I can't give you an answer. Look in the Chassam Sofer. Look in the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer does not give a definitive conclusion. What the Chazon Ish meant was that there is no definitive conclusion. This is a dilemma that we simply don't have the answer to. We don't know, what should the gadol do? Should the gadol leave the city, pray for the people, and at least save his own life and rebuild Klal Yisrael? Or better that the gadol goes down in the fire with the people? Says the Chassam Sofer, this is an age-old debate that we simply don't have a definitive answer to. Be it as it may, the decision of Rabbi Menachem Zemba, the decision of Rabbi Shimshon Stackhammer, the decision of Rabbi David Kahana Shapiro was that they need to stay with the people. A captain does not abandon the people. Now, Rabbi Zon told me that it was very difficult for him to understand this psak. What possibly could a Gadol B'Yisrael do in the Warsaw Ghetto 24 hours before it would be bombed out of the world? 24 hours before the Warsaw Ghetto was obliterated. What was the tachlis? What was the purpose of these Gedolim sticking it out in the ghetto? As we mentioned, many Rosh Yeshiva were able to rebuild their lives and rebuild their yeshivas. What did they do? What purpose did they serve? And Rabbi Zon told me he really could not understand what the benefit of these Gedolim sticking it out in the ghetto was until he heard a story that my grandfather wrote about his experiences in the Warsaw Ghetto. Now this is a point of great controversy, halachic controversy, historical controversy. But I'm going to tell you what my grandfather told me. Rabbi Menachem Zemba paskined in the Warsaw Ghetto, that Rabbi Menachem Zemba repeatedly and emphatically gave sanction to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He held they were not allowed to just get down and die like sheep. They needed to rebel and fight. Actually, my grandfather was a member of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He was a lookout. He had exceptional vision. Even past his 90s, my grandfather didn't need to wear glasses. My grandfather said, the hardest part about turning 100 years old is that the Rashi letters on the side of the Gemara are a little bit more difficult to see. That's the hardest part about being 100. Halavai, we should all experience that. Rabbi Menachem Zemba paskin, and I'll read to you his words. Umitam zeh ani roya shelafi hahalacha mitzvah hamered b'meitav tachsisei hamelchama kiddush Hashem yeshkan. Rabbi Menachem Zemba paskin that to fight even to your last breath against the Nazis was Melchemes mitzvah. And many Gedolim agreed. Radzina Rebbe fought in the uprising. There was a Rab Zemelman who was a member of the uprising. Never in the sad saga of Jewish history did people fight with such dignity. They had no weapons, they had no arms. They fought, so to speak, like mythological lions to preserve the dignity of the Jewish people. But even so, Rabbi Isai, what possibly could these Rabbanim have accomplished by sticking it out in the Warsaw Ghetto? You know, I'll tell you, we mentioned the fate of Shimshon Stockhammer. Rav Shimshon Stockhammer, who stuck it out, eventually he was actually taken out of the ghetto. He was brought to a death camp near Lublin. His entire family was killed. In this death camp, Rav Shimshon Stockhammer baked matzos in Pesach 1944. A year later, just imagine the condition that this Rav was in. He was broken, he was ill, he had no kayach, and it was Pesach 1945. And Rav Stockhammer was taken to another camp in southern Germany. He comes there gravely ill, and he made the following announcement. Says Rav Stockhammer, I do not plan on eating chametz for the next 8 days. So his students told him, Rebbe, not eating chametz means you're not eating for 8 days, you're going to die. You can't give up your life not to eat chametz. It's not one of the 3 big averos. And Rav Shimshon Stockhammer paskined as follows. He says, I know what the halacha is. I know that regularly one cannot risk their life not to eat chametz. But there are 2,500 Yidden in this camp. Somebody has to show the world that there's still a Torah, and there's still a Pesach, and there's still an Isser Chametz. I've been makabel this mitzvah upon myself. So for 8 days, miraculously, all Rav Stockhammer did was he drank water. He was kamada goises, he was kamada corpse, and he fasted for 8 consecutive days. At the end of the war, liberation was approaching very fast. This is already April 1945. Liberation would be any day. Rav Stockhammer, together with the entire camp, all 2,500 Jews, were rounded up onto the cattle cars. They were headed to the Tyrol Mountains, but their cart was bombed. The Rav was critically wounded. He died 13th day of Iyar, 3 days before liberation. So what possibly could these 3 Gedolei Yisrael have offered the people? The Warsaw Ghetto was about to be destroyed. It was about to be firebombed. There were going to be no survivors. Why wouldn't these Gedolim take advantage of the opportunity to save their own skin? Rabbi Zon told me that when he saw the story that my grandfather wrote about what these Gedolim were doing in the Warsaw Ghetto, he understood the full impact of this decision that they made in the Warsaw Ghetto. My grandfather wrote, we were hauled to the forced labor camp in Bedzin, where we labored under the most brutal conditions. In the early morning darkness, in the freezing temperature, in the bitter cold, we performed back-breaking labor, being whipped and whipped and whipped. What gave us the mysterious strength and endurance to continue breathing? My grandfather wrote, Lule soiroscha sha'ashuai azavadati va'ani. We stood together on those abysmal nights, together with the great rabbis of Warsaw, Rab Shimshon Stockhammer, Rab David Kahana Shapiro, and other great giants who were able to recite by heart the text of the Gemara, the text of the Talmud Bavli. The Gemara that these precious souls recited by heart gave us the supernatural endurance to carry on, to continue to breathe, and to have a vision and hope for the future. It was these Rabbanim and the hope that they infused in us that allowed us to survive the war and ultimately rebuild our lives. Rabbi Zon told me he finally understood the full impact of this decision of Das Torah 74 years ago, of why these Gedolim felt that they needed to stick it out with the people. By learning with them, by teaching them Torah in the impossible situation, it infused them with courage, with dignity, with hope for the future. It would then not be an overstatement to say that my grandfather survived the war because of that decision of Das Torah. That these three great Torah giants made, Reb Shimshon Stackhammer, Reb Menachem Zemba, and Reb David Kana Shapiro, that this is what gave him the courage and the strength to be able to survive the brutality. And then it would not be an overstatement to mention that I too stand here today only because of that courageous decision of those three great Torah giants who stuck it out with the people, who at their own expense and the expense of their own families felt they could not abandon their brothers. To give a definitive answer of what is the halacha, what should the gadol do, what should the rav do? Should he try to save his own life, rebuild his Torah, rebuild his Talmidim, or stick it out with the people and stay with the ship? This is a great decision that we don't have a clear answer to. Perhaps all we're able to say is Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. But just as, to a large degree, the Jewish people today have been rebuilt by those great rabbis, those Rosh Yeshiva, those Admorim, who took advantage of the opportunity to save their lives and come to Eretz Yisrael, come to America, and rebuild Torah, we could equally say that Klal Yisrael today has been rebuilt upon the self-sacrifice and the Mesiras Nefesh of the Gedolei Olam, of the true Manhigei Yisrael, who gave up their life to be loyal to their Kehilos, to be loyal to their brothers and sisters. Hashlich nafsha mineged, with complete abandonment for their own welfare, stuck it out with the people. And it's their courage and their dignity and the brilliant light of their personality that we continue to bask in and we continue to build upon. And the future of Klal Yisrael is so much brighter because of these two true Torah leaders who would not abandon their brethren at a time of tsar. I'll just conclude. Recently we discovered a manuscript that my grandfather wrote about the final death march that he was on when he was liberated. And on this death march, my grandfather describes how people were dropping. People were dropping. And you couldn't grieve for them, and you couldn't say Kaddish for them, you couldn't mourn for them, because the night was long and the bullets in abundance. If you stopped for a moment, the bullets would relieve you of the march immediately. And people were dropping, saying goodbye, I can't go on, this is where I should fall. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And my grandfather turns around, there's 700 people on this death march. 200 were come out in the next world already. And what came to mind was the vision of Yecheskel Hanavi. Remember Yecheskel's prophecy of the dry bones? He's in the valley of Dura and he sees piles and piles of dry bones. And Yecheskel asks, will these dry bones come alive again? Well, on that fateful death march, my grandfather said, the prophecy of Yecheskel came to his mind. And he too asked about these 700 Yidden marching through the icy terrain, these 700 corpses, so to speak, dry bones. Will these dry bones come to life? But these dry bones have come to life. You look at the Jewish people today, all of those dry bones have rebuilt themselves, they were resuscitated, they were resurrected. The Rebbeinu Shalom showered on those survivors the dew of Tchias HaMesim, the Tal Torah, the Tal HaTchiyah. And there's been a renaissance and resuscitation of Torah throughout the world. But there's still a lot of work to do. We're all awaiting the final Tchias HaMesim. May we merit to see the Haramas Keren Yisrael, the day where the dignity of the Jewish people will be raised up, the Haramas Keren HaTorah. May we all merit to see the coming of the Bias Goyal Tzedek, Mher V'Yameinu. Amen.